Hi, Rick.
Hi, Brittany. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing great. I'm doing great.
Look, you looking great during this pandemic.
Thanks. I showered.
Oh, there you go. It's the little things. It's the little,
Right.
very minor things.
Hello, everyone. From quarantine, #quarantine life, become our kind of our new normal, and scheduling as many webinars as we possibly can to give you guys some, hopefully some breaks from the monotony of just kind of sitting at home and being on your computer or your phone and taking care of kids and pets and dogs and all of that good stuff. So just a few housekeeping things. Our presentation today, our webinar today is by Brittany Clay. She's a communications consultant. And she also works for the University of Texas at Austin. And she's also an amazing, wonderful, former, brilliant employee of TASA, and we miss her deeply. But we're happy that she's doing great things. And so she is going to be giving you some information about leveraging local media for survivor support during COVID-19. If any of y'all have kind of been on a multitude of our webinars, you've known that we've kind of been using COVID as a means to keep folks connected, ironically, right? And so a lot of our webinars have been geared towards that, and a lot of the information we've been giving out has been geared towards that as well. So we hope that this is really helpful for you. Just a couple of things really quickly. If any of you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, or you can just put your question in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring those questions in the chat for Brittany so that she doesn't get distracted from what she's talking about. And then when she has a pause, if there's a question, I'll ask for that and make sure that it gets addressed. One quick note on the chat: if you are sending a chat, make sure that first of all, if you don't know how to access it, and I'm sure everybody does, but if you're on an iPad or an iPhone or any kind of tablet, you just kind of tap your screen and it should come down where the three dots are. You should click on more, and then you'll see chat right there. If you're on your laptop, you can just hover, and I think it's at the bottom of your screen. Make sure that when you do your question, if you would like everyone to know what your question is, make sure that on the send to, it has a drop-down box and it says all panelists, all attendees, or all panelists and attendees. Make sure that you're sending it to everyone if you want everyone to be able to know what your question was. And I'll make sure that I do that as well. I'm infamous for just sending it over to myself and not sending it out to you guys. And then once this is over, we'll kind of wrap things up, and you should get an email from us thanking you for your participation and a certificate of attendance, I think. So with that, I will turn it over to Brittany. It's all yours, Britt.
Thank you so much, Rick. I appreciate the introduction. Like Rick said, I previously worked for TASA, and I miss my peoples very much. In addition to working at TASA as a communications manager, I also have been in PR for about 10-ish years. And so I noticed I wanted to do this webinar because I saw that COVID-19 was simply dominating the news cycle. It's dominating on a national level, on a local level, on an international level. And while I think it's important for the general public to know the ins and outs of this crisis, I also think it's critical for people to understand how this pandemic has impacted survivors of sexual assault and survivors of like sexual violence and domestic violence. And so I feel like in order for those stories to be heard and for the stories of the crisis programs that serve survivors to be heard, we have to find a way to weave the narrative and insert ourselves into the narrative in a way that is relevant to today's news trends and news coverage. So that is why we're here. So my objectives for today are to hopefully folks can walk away able to identify trends and potential media stories related to your program and survivors in light of COVID-19. I want you to be able to improve your outreach to local media. And many of you are not communications managers or don't have PR experience, but I do think with, if we could learn the basic fundamentals, there's a way that you can really get your stories out there, because I know not every program is going to have the funding or have the capacity for one person designated to communications. It's a bit of a privilege. So if you don't have a designated communications person or any PR experience, I want you to be able to walk away today with an improved understanding of how to talk with and reach out to local media. And then the last part, I want you to be able to develop key messages and to improve your interview techniques with local media. I think that that's a really critical part as well. So I kind of already went into COVID-19 and survivors, but COVID-19 has really put survivors in a very, not even just survivor, but people are in very vulnerable situations. And because of the vulnerable situations with the job loss, with the housing insecurity, and with maybe being in isolation with an abuser, you don't have as much access to resources, and it's going to escalate. It could potentially escalate circumstances even more. So I kind of wanted to start off by just hopping into some news stories that I've already seen about COVID-19. And I've seen local news stories and I've seen national news stories, but not a ton. So the ones that I saw, I wanted to kind of dissect what makes them good, and how these stories are really built out. Because that's really the main purpose of media outreach. You're trying to help a reporter build a story that is relevant to the communities that they are serving. And it's going to resonate most deeply with your local media. So that's where I always suggest that we start. But I saw some interesting trends as well on a national scale, so I figured I'd share some of those. So here are two stories that I saw. One was landlords are allegedly asking for sex from tenants who can't afford to pay rent right now, which is despicable, disgusting, as you know. And this was actually picked up from BuzzFeed, which has hundreds of millions of views a year on their website. It was picked up from a local news story in Hawaii. And here is another one on NPR. Child sexual abuse reports are on the rise amid lockdown orders. So, and this one features expertise from RAIN, the national organization that provides resources for survivors. So I wanted to dissect the BuzzFeed one. What are some of the highlights of this story? Okay, hold on just 1 second. So some of the highlights of the story. For one, whenever you're building out a media story, you always, I'll kind of skip down here to what highlights you should be looking for and aiming to insert in a story when you're talking to media. So one, you want to share an important trend that's going on in your center. So let's say that you're seeing an uptick in domestic violence calls. As soon as you can identify trends, those emerging trends, or you're seeing an uptick in calls come in from survivors from the age of 16 to 19, like maybe a 20% uptick versus last year or the previous month. Those are some trends that you want to identify and insert into a media pitch to share with media. Next, you want to make sure that an expert from your staff or from the local community is featured in the story, so that it's just not a bunch of nonsense, but it's someone who knows what they're talking about and can talk about it in a very responsible way. Next, some highlights from a story is when resources are shared. This is so important, whether it be your specific center or a center that serves a specific demographic or group. if you can get those into a news story or those in a news story, it's a win, because the more that is shared, the more you have an opportunity for people to learn about your program and the work that you're doing, how you're helping survivors, and maybe you'll have more people who need help see the story and they have an easy way to get support. Another one is a call to action. Now, if you can get a call to action in there, such as, you know, please share this, or we're actually low on hand sanitizer, or we're low on cleaning supplies for the shelter that we provide for families. Like, please, you can call us for donations. If that can be highlighted, that's a win. That's a huge win. So going from there, now that we've kind of identified those trends, I want to dive into where some of that stuff is highlighted in this BuzzFeed article. So one of the first things they show is, like, we have seen an uptick in sexual harassment, and that's the legal director of Open Communities. This happened in Hawaii. And Ring said her organization has seen a 3-fold increase in sexual harassment complaints related to housing in the last month. When I tell you, media, they love data. They just eat it up. So if you have something like concrete metrics, like, we monitor every single call that comes into our program, and we have seen a jump from 20% having experienced harassment from an employer to 45%. If there are any leaps in numbers, or if you've seen a significant decrease, let's say that your organization was working very closely with the local school district and you were getting referrals from counselors. Now that students and children are not in school, let's say you went from being, 60% of your referrals coming from these local school districts to 10%. That's a terrifying metric that deserves to be shared, so that the community is aware that while these instances of child abuse are still taking place, we're not getting those reports. Therefore, students are suffering in silence and in isolation. So if you have any important trends or metrics that you observed, it's critical that that is included in your outreach and makes it into the news story. And also, here we have an expert who does legal aid and fair housing. Next, we have someone who's talking relatively responsibly, using survivor-centered language, can speak on the movement. So this specifically says, landlords sexually harassing tenants is not a new situation, but large swaths of the community now being unemployed or in financial distress has made even more people vulnerable. I like the way that it's not focused on, it's focused on predators and predators exploiting the circumstances to further inflict abuse on other people. It's not about, oh, survivors, it's a very responsibly written sentence, and that goes to who you're working with on a story, identifying media contacts who know how to speak about sexual assault and know how to speak about it in a responsible way, as well as experts who know how to speak about it in responsible ways. And they go on to say, this is the executive director of human services for women in Hawaii. Of course, that's not the root cause of why it's happening, but it makes it easier because now landlords have access to people at their fingertips, essentially, while they're most vulnerable. So those are some trends have been identified, and you have experts who are inserted in this story, and then there's resources shared. Instead, she said, and these are just takeaways. I know this doesn't flow or make any sense, but these are just screenshots that I took from the story of some of the highlights I liked. But it says, instead, she said that any person being sexually harassed by their landlord should contact local legal aid or tenants' rights organizations and get immediate legal help. So she has this call to action or shared resources, and then the story links to an online guide from this executive director for how women in Hawaii can respond to harassment from landlords. And it gives paragraphs of tips and information and contact numbers for people who who need access to these resources and to this help. So I have a link here, and this was shared by a local media company, a local TV station in Hawaii, and then this is a BuzzFeed story. So what you'll see is that oftentimes local media, they're the ones who uncover these stories because of their roots in these local communities. And then national reporters and agencies will pick up that coverage to amplify those messages and share them more widely. That is a wonderful benefit that comes sometimes when you have a story that hadn't really been told before, or something just like really abnormal or unusual spike in a trend or issue. That doesn't always happen, but there's always the potential for that to happen. So that's why I always say start on a smaller scale, reach out to your local news markets and your local media reporters, and you increase your chances of getting coverage. What did I do? Oh, here we go. Okay. So those were some national stories. This is a local story. These are local stories. One is KUT, which is Austin's NPR station. Another one is CBS DFW, and it's from Hope's Door. Fun fact, the new CEO of Hope's Door is Christina Coltes, who used to work at TASA. So, you know, I didn't choose them because she's there, but that certainly helped. I also thought it was a really good news story, but she is just so on top of things, and she's so good in this interview that I wanted to use it as an example. So I'll dive into what makes this a good news story and how kind of the reporter doesn't necessarily lay everything out in the easiest way, but it still ended up being a very good story. So it opens with a trend, an important trend to share with media. A domestic violence shelter in Plano is seeing an increase in calls for help from abused women, its CEO said. CEO is Christina Coltes. And Coltes said, so that's the trend. And then there's another important trend as well that's mentioned in this story. Coltes said the rooms are where victims of spousal abuse seek comfort and confide in counselors. Now that's happening online. So the story is talking about this uptick in trend in calls from women that are isolated with abusers. And then it talks about because of the shelter in place, we are no longer able to do in-person counseling, but now those services are available online. So that's just really important information that's being shared with people who could potentially see this story and know that there's still help available to them. And it's important for the general public to be aware, for them to keep their eyes and ears open in case they see something, they can say something. So she shared an important trend, she shared resources, and then there's an important call to action too. Not explicitly saying, send us these things, but she's able to insert a quote that says, our shelter is lacking in some critical supplies. We are concerned for the long haul that they have the resources to keep the shelter clean and to keep everybody safe and well, because they have families in a shelter on site. So they were able to mention this in the story that was not only a write-up, but it was an actual news story that aired on the local CBS station. And so here you don't necessarily see, you see resources and important information shared, but when I looked at the article, I did not see Hope's Door's website or phone number. And I was like, well, shucks, that's not ideal, because now people are going to have to hunt this down. It's not as easily accessible. But when I watched the news story, there was an interesting like little shot where they lingered on this truck, and it says the website, and it has their branding, and it has the phone number. So Survivor, they found a way to drop that into the story in a very subtle way where people are still getting the information they need. I thought that touched on all 4 points of what we want to cover in our news stories, and that's when you find an article that is successful. So now that we've identified what makes some of these articles successful, I want to get into how to do this. And I promise you, you can do it. I believe in you. So Working with local media, for the most part, it's great. You know, I listened to a podcast, and the podcast said, you know, you need to support your local media because they serve as oversight to local government, local politics, the local community. They are always investigating issues that are going on in the community and raising awareness around them. So that's a positive way to look at local media and the role they play in getting important information shared with people in that location. So first things first, when you're crafting a story or trying to propose a story to local media, you want to first check in with your team. This can be really quickly. This could be something that's already being discussed, that's coming up in staff meetings or, you know, Zoom meetings, or just from people doing the work and casually talking, saying, man, I noticed that we're getting a lot of calls from, you know, people who are going through addiction. Like, we are getting significant amount of calls, way more than I saw last month. And that might be someone who's working on the hotline for your agency. It's good to just have people that are on the front lines doing this, who know what's happening, to talk with them. So work with your team to identify important information that needs to be shared with the public. So if you're seeing an uptick or a significant decrease, though, or you're seeing a significant shortage, like we were getting regular updates or regular donations, you know, normally we see 10,000 donations a month and we got $100. I'm telling you now that media would pick up that story, because that is just such a drastic change, and it's a trend. Obviously, if the numbers are going down, that can be tied into, well, people are experiencing unemployment, job insecurity, and now because of that, our program is suffering and doesn't have the resources to provide services to individuals experiencing abuse. Boom. And so first, you want to identify some important information that needs to be shared, and important trends and important data and metrics. And then you want to identify local media outlets and the best media contacts. This is, you know, if you live in a town where there's one newspaper, you don't have as much wiggle room, and I totally understand that. However, normally there's 1 to 3 or 2 to 4 local news channels or local news stations. And so you want to work with a news station that you've worked with before. You want to start there. Like, if you worked with a station before and they've already covered you, or something that's going on, a program that you did, a fundraising event, then you can start there because they're already familiar with your organization. And then you would already know whether or not you like the results of the story or the coverage. Start there. Also, you want to find contacts who know how to speak responsibly about an issue. So let me see if I can find this story. One second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just 1 second, and then I'm going to find a news story that was just kind of a home run.
Hey, Brittany.
Yes.
Can I bring up a point and ask you a question as well that maybe we can address later?
Yes.
But I thought it was really important because you had you talked about the importance of working with local media and using them as a resource to kind of help you with your needs and to kind of get information out into the public. But what I think is also really interesting is that, you know, the media will pick up on those really great stories and those important stories and report back, right? Specifically, if there's an increase in sexual assault or DV call cases coming in. But what we also have to remember is that if you are, and this is kind of the bad side of it, but if you are letting staff go, if your doors aren't open, if you aren't able to serve, or things are kind of in turmoil at your agency, the media will also pick up on those things. And
yes,
so,
they will.
Yeah, and so those are kinds of things to kind of keep in mind as well. That when you're going through trials and tribulations as an agency, specifically now because we know that some agencies just may not have the capacity to serve, doing it away from the office, that the media might also pick up on that information as well. So it's really important to kind of have a game plan and understand too that, you know, those negative sides of the work that we do will also get picked up by local media. So I didn't know if you wanted to address that.
Yeah, I actually think it's important I think that's good information for the media to share. Even though it seems like it would be negative, people need to know just how disproportionately we have an issue that's already an underserved issue. We know that most survivors aren't coming forward. We know they aren't going to have the access to resources that they need. We know that a large majority of survivors that already historically have had less access to resources aren't even going to always be featured in these stories or have any data because of how limited people have access to that knowledge. I think if there are layoffs that are happening, that's information that the public needs to be aware of, and hopefully that can spark some type of more rallying support from the local community, saying, hey, just so you know, we had 10 people on staff and we had to lay off or furlough 50% of our staff. Now we are under-resourced and calls are going up. We need help. And that can be a part of some campaign where you're rallying support from the community, maybe not monetary, but donations, volunteers who can go through volunteer training. I think that's a very good point, Rick. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to share my screen because I found specifically what I was looking for. So when identifying local media outlets and media contacts, it's also good if you can find someone who is familiar with covering sexual assault issues or sexual violence or domestic violence, who's aware of issues that disproportionately face women or know about issues that who can speak responsibly, who are familiar with the movement and the cause. So one good example of that is I saw a story on Dallas Morning News, and it was covered by, and I went and looked and I saw that it's a scary situation for kids, how volunteers assigned to Dallas abuse victims monitor foster homes amid coronavirus. And so when I saw the headline, I was like, I wonder who wrote this story, because during legislative session last year, we worked closely with a reporter named Sharon Grisby. And sure enough, she's the one who wrote this story. That's kind of a slam dunk in terms of who you should reach out to. For one, she covers this on a regular basis. She covered legislative session. She covered some important bills, HB 33, where we were trying to increase the statute of limitations. She also she identifies and shares publicly about being a survivor. So when you're looking for your local media to pitch or to reach out to, if you're unfamiliar or you don't know where to start with who's already covering this issue and who has covered it well. And this is an example of, like, if you want to find someone who's going to be able to talk about sexual abuse or sexual violence, then Sharon would be the spot on person who's looking for these types of stories, and it increases your chances of coverage.
Hey, Brittany, there's a comment or in the chat that I thought you might want to address. It's kind of a question, but also a solution as well. But I don't know if you see it from an attendee named Suzanne Tomerlin.
Okay, if you were seeing a downward trend in domestic violence calls to our hotline, we feel certain due to isolation. That is okay to report, correct? The main point, yes. If you went from receiving, I don't know, I might throw out a number that just doesn't even make sense, but let's say you're getting 50 calls a day, and then you're about domestic violence, and then you go to seeing 2 calls a day. That is so alarming. That is such an alarming statistic. And you would know, you can theorize that it's related to isolation. So yes, I think that that's important to share, because if the public is aware that abusers are not able to get help because they are isolated with their abusers, you may find neighbors who are reporting on their behalf. You may find close friends who say, who are, and that call to action can be like, please check on your friends, or find subtle ways to check in and find creative ways to share this information. So if you share a metric in a problem that you're seeing, it's helpful in your key messages, which I will talk about later, that you provide potential solutions. That maybe you don't know the exact reason, but you can theorize and say, we believe that this is a result of COVID and folks being isolated and not having any access to the outside world. With that, we want to find creative ways for survivors to be reached. And we're asking for the public to really just check in on what they're seeing, or check in on their neighbors, or check in on their friends, from even with social distancing in place. So yes, I think that that's one that you can still report on. So let me go back to sharing my, okay. So work with local media, find the best contacts, craft or short pitch. I'm trying to tell you, you can do this. You can absolutely do this. And a pitch is just going to be a short message that you send to media. I have an example of a pitch below, and I'll make sure that you get access to this information. I believe it's going to be uploaded on YouTube shortly after this, shortly after it's finished. So we'll make sure that you are aware of this information, but I'll have an example of key messages and a short pitch. So once you reach out to media and they say, hey, we're interested in this story, then you're gonna have to do an interview. And interviews feel scary. They feel scary for me when I have to do an interview. And, but I think it's best to go with someone who has experience with speaking with local media. And if not, if you don't have a senior leader on your team, or the CEO or the executive director that's available or feels comfortable, then of course going with someone who's on the front lines, who is the advocate providing the support and the resources and the services, or someone working on the hotline who's the one fielding these calls, who's getting these calls and hearing directly from the individuals who are having these experiences. So identify a person who can be interviewed. Prep for the interview with key messages. I do key messages for everything. If I have to call a bill collector, I'm going to organize my thoughts on a piece of paper and just say, well, here are my few points. If I have a difficult conversation in live, I just organize my thoughts and say, these are my key points. I think it's essential if you're doing an interview with media for you to just have those messages prepared in advance, so that you at least have an idea of what you need to say, just the top 5 things that need to happen. So it's organized and you don't speak too, aren't too long-winded about a specific issue. So please craft key messages. Next, if a story, I would say that during my time as a communications manager, almost every interview that we triage to staff and to our team experts, our content experts, they wanted to speak with the survivor. Media, they seem to always want to speak with the survivor. And so if you have a survivor that would like to share their story, that is interested in sharing their story and can safely share their story, then I think it's important for, once the reporter arrives, that you are very clear as an advocate, as a person organizing the story, to say, hey, some of this may be difficult for the survivor who's interested in being interviewed to share. Please establish consent before asking difficult questions. Say, I would like to ask you more about this specific incident. Is that okay? Or establish that this is a safe space and that you can stop me at any moment, or you can stop at any moment. And if you need to take a break, please do. So little things like that. I've had an incident before where a he was pretty inexperienced and just new, and it seemed almost forceful. And I had to pull him to the side and say I was uncomfortable with the way he was conducting the interview. And that's not necessarily something I wanted to have to do, but I think as a person who is providing services, you always are in that kind of the advocate role. And plus it's a learning experience for reporters. The more they do these stories, the more they learn and they become comfortable and more responsible about it. So I think it's also a teaching opportunity. So be prepared to stop the interview or take a break with a reporter if you feel like they're being inappropriate, or if the survivor who's being interviewed feels uncomfortable. So those are some of my top tips for working with media. Now here's a pitch example. So what I did was I wrote a pitch based on that BuzzFeed article about landlords exploiting some of their tenants in financial binds. So I wrote a pitch based on that story, like if I were reaching out to the local media organization. So it's to April, it's as if I'm still working at TASA and all of that. And so, hi, April, I'm reaching out to see if you'd be interested with talking with us about a disturbing trend that we've seen during the COVID-19 crisis. So it's relevant to the current news cycle. And then it says, at least 10 women have contacted us about their landlords who asked for sex in exchange for rent payment. While sexual harassment is not uncommon, this specific power dynamic is not one we hear as often. So I established a number, a trend, and how it's significant to COVID, because this is not something we see as frequently as other forms of harassment, maybe workplace harassment. And I kept it really short. And it's like, if you're interested in talking with us, our CEO, I didn't put her name, but it would have been Rose Luna, is available for comment. And we have a survivor who is interested in sharing her story. So I make it clear to them what experts we have who can speak more to this issue. And then I just asked, would you be interested in talking with our staff? And ideally, my contact information would be down there, just my phone number. So that is an example of a pitch, so short and sweet, to the point. And when you're finding news media, let's say that you're not able to identify someone who would be the best contact. There's not, maybe you can't find their email. Usually their emails are right in their stories or right on the website. You can always reach out to a local news station and reach out to their news desk, and they will forward it to, they will assign the story to someone if they're interested. And if they don't get back to you after 1 or 2 emails, then you can always give a call. I personally am team give a call. I will call media from my car. I will just call them any time of the day and say, and just be super thoughtful and quick and say, hey, I reached out about a news story and it was about this disturbing trend. I wanted to see if someone would be interested in talking with our center. We want to make sure that other women know that there are resources and that they don't have to, that this is illegal, and that they are aware of their rights. And so something like that. And usually people will be like, oh, I forgot, or you're Brittany, okay. And they'll be able to get a voice to an email. And many times I've been able to get a story that I never got an email response to covered because I called. So next is our key message example. These are just based again on that BuzzFeed story based in Hawaii. Even though I used some Texas data, this is if we were to write about it anywhere here. So we know sexual violence is about power and control. 33% of all Texans will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. That's a number from IDVSA here at UT Austin. And so then from there, those are just numbers in case you're asked about what's the data, or why does this happen, or and then another example is just like the numbers are already high, and yet COVID-19 has put people in even more vulnerable situations, and predators are exploiting that. So that might be something you want to mention. It goes back to this example. We're seeing this because now more people are in financial distress and they're vulnerable. So that's kind of linked, that talking point is linked there. So then again, you're going into what my trend is, have an expert. We have important information and resources that are being shared. We want anyone else who is being exploited and abused by their landlord to know they can contact us and we will help. This is illegal. This is not your fault, and you are not alone. And then you contact us and make sure you have the number and email and website readily available, and follow up and send that information to the reporter as well, or the editor who's covering you. Then if you have a call to action or a request, find a way to insert that into the story. Normally reporters will say, well, how can people help? And you can say, well, we want you to check in on your friends. We want you to check in on your neighbors. If you know someone who is in a relationship and you suspect abuse, then say something, call someone, share this website. Or, you know, if your shelter or your program needs resources, they need volunteers, or they're offering a, you know, Zoom volunteer training or something like that. Say, you know, due to this crisis, we want to help people that are being sexually harassed by their landlords and don't feel safe at home. So we have them here in a shelter. However, we're low on cleaning supplies. We're low on canned goods, and we're limited on what services we can provide unless we're able to get some support. We're able to get some more donations. So, and then you can have the information dropped in there. So yeah, that's an example. Those are just an example of a key message, but you can keep it short, like, you know, five points that you just want to ensure that you cover during that interview, or you want to ensure that you're prepared for in case there are questions. You also, you might also say information in addition to this based on how the conversation is going with the media outlet, but you just want to make sure that you're prepared. So anytime I was preparing key points for our former, you know, policy director at TASA, or for the CEO, I would always just put in our go-to metrics. I would look at the subject matter that they were being interviewed about, whether or not it was some legislative information, and I would make sure they had that right in front of them so that when those questions would come up, they were fully prepared. So that is pretty much everything. I am open for questions if anyone has any, or Rick, if you have some.
Thank you, Brittany. I do actually. I wanted to see if you might address something that happens sometimes with media, where you send out either a press release or an announcement, or, you know, a pitch, and they accept and they say yes, but then they switch the story on you, and their angle kind of goes in a different direction than what you originally wanted it to be, right? And so I was wondering if you had any tips on how to redirect or bring it back to what you wanted them to originally say. I think that's, and the reason why I asked that question is I think it's really important, right? That, you know, we get to control, in a lot of ways, you know, the messaging and what we want to say. And also, like, how much do you say? Because ironically, what's funny is my partner and I own a business here in San Antonio, and he's been getting a lot of media coverage about COVID-19, because we had to close our doors and, you know, ask questions about unemployment and PPP and all of that stuff. And what was really interesting is we saw the article or the news piece, and it was like 5 words out of the entire 10 sentences that he gave, and he was like, well, they didn't even say this, or I talked about this and they didn't do that. And I'm like, right, they're looking for certain keywords, and they wanted to message and angle the story in this way, right? So, you know, they're not going to take everything that you say. So anyway, with that, for the sake of rambling, do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Rick, thank you so much. That's an excellent question. I can give 2 examples of how to reroute the story back to where you're in, not to They can always, media, they don't always do this, but some will try to misconstrue what you're saying or take your words out of context. That definitely can happen. Or they'll have an idea of how they want to position the story, and they'll try to lead you into supporting the narrative that they're trying to create. Now, this isn't something, I don't want to scare everyone. This does sometimes happen. And this is why, in my opinion, key messages are like, they're everything, because they'll try to get you off track. And if you know that there's, 5 key highlights that you want to talk about, then you can always reroute it back to that. But let's say that you were talking to media and you're pitching the story about landlords trying to exploit their tenants who are in financial distress with, sexual harassment. And what if they're, positioning the stories like, oh, women are sleeping with their landlords because they can't pay their rent. That could definitely be it could be someone who's just absolutely terrible or just super irresponsible, trying to twist that story into it not being about a predator preying on people who are vulnerable, but instead trying to position it like this is some type of consensual give and take. The reason I use the BuzzFeed example and not the example from the local news story is because I felt like they kind of tried to twist that story with the headline, with their headline. Will show that to you.
And Carol had a comment. She said that if possible, stick with journalists who have integrity in their reporting and story, which is an amazing tip. And you do that also by building relationships with your media folks and finding that one person that is going to understand your issue and is going to be fair in how they do that. Another great thing is if you can possibly get someone from your local media, either print or television, on your board.
Oh, look at you, Rick. Rick also used to be communications at TASA, but that's a wonderful, wonderful suggestion. That's a really, really good suggestion. And that's something that I don't necessarily have an example of that, but I do know at TASA that awards are given at the TASA conference every year to a media individual who's especially responsible and especially informed and serves as kind of an champion for the people in their news reporting. So I think that's a great idea, and not one that I would have thought of. So here's an example of this BuzzFeed story. They talk about it. Landlords are allegedly asking for sex from tenants who can't afford to pay rent. It's very focused on kind of they're asking for something, they're preying on people. But the local news story I saw, Hawaii landlords reportedly exchanging sexual favors for rent. It almost positions it as if it's consensual, even though in the body of the story, it's written more responsibly. But I think that making sure the way that you're talking about the issue is clear. Like, this is happening not because cases have gone down. This is happening because women are isolated with their abusers and they're not able to seek out help or reach out to us. Or being clear that, people aren't exchanging sex with their landlords because this isn't something they're doing consensually because they want to. This is a predator who is exploiting someone who is in a vulnerable situation. So outlining it in a way that's responsible so that when you speak about the issue, your words can't be taken out of context. And sometimes they'll still try. Another thing too is, I think I talked about an example from one of the experts that was listed in here. And they said, this is not the reason. Of course, COVID-19 is not necessarily the root cause of why this is happening, but it makes it easier because now landlords have access. That's another, exploring root causes and making sure people are aware of that information. It's outlined in your key messages, and it's outlined in the way that you pitch and reach out to media. And also, like what was said in the chat, working with people who are already responsible and can speak, who are aware of the issue and can speak about the issue in a responsible way and have integrity. And that goes back to covering, working with someone that's already covered the issue. So do I have any other questions? Or Rick, do you have any more questions for me? Because you come to this with some understanding too, because you previously used to do this.
Yeah, it's hard, it's tough, and it's I hate to say it's a game, but you have to maneuver through and just stick to what you want your message to be. Always try to bring it back to that.
Bring it back. There was one other thing. When I worked at TASA, we would regularly get requests from media to talk about, this young girl was lured into a hotel with a predator that they met online, and they thought it was a 13-year-old boy. How can you prevent your daughters from falling victim to these predators? And I would always have to get back to these reporters and say, well, in terms of prevention, we don't talk about risk reduction. That's not something that we will talk about. We will talk about more systemic issues of why people are predators, or why they, prey on young people, and why this is their fault, and it's not the responsibility of the mom or the young girl to not be, assaulted. It's on the responsibility of the person to not commit sexual violence. And they're like, yeah, but we just want some prevention tips, like check your kids' phones. Like, we actually won't comment on risk reduction stories, and we can't talk about the risk reduction aspect of it, but we can talk about more systemic issues and the cycle of violence and toxic masculinity. And so many times I would just kind of establish that beforehand, what firm boundaries, things that we won't talk about. We won't victim blame. We won't really discuss risk reduction. We won't put the blame on the minors and their parents. And that was just a hard and firm boundary that we were willing to establish up front. Anything else? We have about 5 more minutes.
Yeah, and feel free to put this in the chat, and I hope this isn't too much of a long-winded question. But have any of y'all who are attending, have you guys had any experience during this pandemic of media calling you to want to either promote your services or assist you in any way, or bolster donations, or have you reached out to the media at all while this is all happening? I'm just curious. You can either put your answer in the chat or raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you can answer.
That's also a really good point. Carol raised a really good point. Here's a good example of what if Carol, correct me if I'm not on the right track here, but one that I specifically think about is when the Me Too movement happened, it was a national, international story. However, local news media, they wanted to hear directly from folks that were on the front lines at some of these rape crisis programs. It's like, have you seen an uptick in calls or anything because of the Me Too movement? And we were getting those types of inquiries from local media at TASA as well. So because of a national news story and a trend, the same happened with the Supreme Court confirmation and Dr. Christine Ford. We got a lot of inquiries from local media because of this national news trend. It's like, how has this impacted your program? Can you tell me a little bit more about what you've seen when teenagers are in these types of situations? And so, yes, having a national topic, it can always tie into local and how it's impacting your program and the survivors in your area and your community.
There's a couple of chats, Brittany, if you want to address those at all.
I see one from Dina. Hi, Dina. Do law enforcement work with local media? All the time. Yeah, they're regularly interviewed in stories. I regularly see law enforcement give their perspective of a specific issue. So if there's one about a trend in sexual assault cases, you're usually going to see an advocate. You're going to see maybe some input from an attorney or a lawyer who can kind of speak to what they're seeing with their clients. And then you'll have input from some law enforcement that might be seeing, or a detective who might be seeing things with these cases. So yes, law enforcement, they do work with local media, and sometimes they do press conferences if the news is big enough. And then Suzanne, awesome. Good luck with reaching out to newspapers today. I hope that you're able to use some of the information that was included. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And okay. Well, good. It's good to know that media is proactively reaching out, but if they're not proactively reaching out, you can definitely get on their radar. Make sure that they don't forget you and your program and the work that you're doing, and don't forget survivors. We just got to find a way to stay top of mind by staying relevant to the news stories and the news trends that are already going on, and inserting ourselves in those. So I'm glad that this was helpful. This was really my pleasure, and happy to talk with you all anytime. This should be online soon. And I can drop my email in here too, in case people have specific questions.
That would be great. I was actually just going to ask you to do that, if you wouldn't mind putting your email address chat for everyone.
Don't mind.
Well, great. So thank you all. Thank you all for attending. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Brittany. Please reach out to me, to any of the TASA staff, really, in regards to any issues that you're having. We are here for you. We are working from home just like everyone else is. And it feels like we're working more from home than when we were in the office. It's very weird.
That's true.
Yeah, I know. But we want to thank you again, and keep a lookout. We will have more webinars coming towards the end of the month, and into about 4 more that are scheduled. So keep a lookout for those, and we will send that information out to everyone as we get them set up. And oh, great point. Laura Hoke is our new communications manager at TASA, and Brittany just put her information in the chat as well. And please give her a call. Just FYI, I did want to mention something. I don't know, Brittany, if this might actually be a really great, if you're looking to something not COVID-19 related, but if you're looking to reach out to your media about a story, and I know we only have a couple minutes left.
Title IX.
Title IX, yes.
Oh,
the new Title IX regulations from the Department of Education were released yesterday, and oh boy, they are something. So if you want more information about that, or how to talk about that, email me. I put my email in the chat, and I'll send you just kind of toss a statement on this. But Brittany, I don't know if that's something you want to talk about, how you can be proactive in talking to the media about it.
Yeah, I mean, the first step would be familiarizing yourself with the new Title IX guidelines. It was about 2,000 pages, but there are some top line overviews from all the major, dailies, New York Times, Washington Post, everyone has covered it. But essentially, there's a lot more protections in place for people that have been accused. And there's a whole ripple effect of how there's like kind of a double standard about how survivors of sexual assault are being treated by Title IX investigators versus people that will just be, victims of a theft. There's just like a double standard for the crimes. So if you happen to have any expertise, or you've worked with college age students or someone who's gone through the Title IX process, and you can talk about the very low rates of false reports, that's a huge part of it. They have these additional protections for people that have been accused, but there wasn't any data to show that this was an issue that needed to be fixed. So yes, there's absolutely opportunities to reach out to local media right now, specifically about Title IX and working with survivors of sexual assault, and how some of the new rulings can prevent survivors on campuses, college campuses, from coming forward. And we already know that many do not come forward. So if you are kind of burned out on COVID-19, or you've exhausted all your options there, Title IX is another trending national issue that you can help, that you can insert yourself into that conversation as well.
Great. Thank you, Britt.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate you all. Thank you for attending.
All right, everyone, stay safe, please, and we will hopefully see each other very soon. And thank you so much for participating. And if you have any questions, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's why we're here. All right?
All right. Bye.
Everyone, have a great weekend.